Hey everybody, and welcome back. I thought today that I would do something a little different. I wanted to do a top 10 video, and I'm going to do a top 10 video on cards that I wanted when I was a kid in the 1980s. So in front of you I have 5 outstanding cards. These are actually my honorable mention. The first one on the left, the Ryan Sandberg rookie card. I wasn't really a big Sandberg fan until late 1989 fall when they had that great Cubs run all the way to the National League Championship Series. They eventually lost to the San Francisco Giants, but he didn't make the cut. And then Kirby Puckett, was never really a big Kirby Puckett fan, even though he did win the championship on the '87 Twins. And then Roger Clemens, he's actually going to be the only pitcher represented in this video. But you can see most everyone else is all hitters, but he didn't make the list either. And then Bo Jackson, the lore of Bo Jackson, or the lore of him, didn't really pick up until like maybe late '89, early '90s. So he really wasn't somebody that I really looked to pick up as a kid. And then the same with Barry Bonds. He really didn't become big, in my opinion, until he went over to the Giants in the early '90s. So he wasn't a guy that I desired to have in the '80s. So I started collecting in 1987, and I want you to keep that in mind when I show these cards. So number 10 card that I wanted to have as a kid, this 1984 Fleer Darryl Strawberry, really sharp card. It was a close call between this and his 84 Donruss, but I really wanted this kid. I had a bunch of his tops, but none of the Fleer. So mindful that Strawberry was fresh off the '86 World Championship with the Mets and was a really big name when I started collecting in '87 as a kid. Number 9, this guy right here, one of the greatest hitters of all time, Tony Gwynn. Gwynn was in a decade of dominance there. I didn't see him play in the World Series back in, what did they make, '84? They made the World Series. So I wasn't collecting cards then. But Tony Gwynn was a great player. Everybody knew this guy was going to be a Hall of Famer at the time, and that's why he makes the list at number 9. Number 8, probably in my opinion, one of the best hitters of the '80s here, Wade Boggs, right up there with Gwynn, a guy that hit for average. And once again, mindful that in '87 he had just come off that a losing effort in the World Series, but the Red Sox were a pretty popular team. And Wade Boggs was just the best hitter on that team. Had a couple of the Hall of Famers, had a Jim Rice towards the tail end of his career, and Roger Clemens, some other big personalities. But Wade Boggs was one of the best hitters in the '80s, and I really, really liked him. And this was a wonderful card that was definitely a must-have for me. Now, the only non-Hall of Famer in this group, the infamous '89 Fleer Billy Ripken FF Air. I tell you what, as a kid growing up, this card, I never even saw it in person. If you were at a card show, the card dealers would probably hide it so that none of the parents would complain. So this legend, I mean, this was legendary. Like, everybody knew this card existed, but none of us had ever seen it or laid eyes on it. So you better believe as an adult, I picked this thing up. One of the most sought after cards for the kids in the neighborhood at school. If you had one of these, you would have been a legend. Unfortunately, no one ever did. Until now. All right, card number 6. His brother, staying with the Ripken family, the Cal Ripken Jr. Now, Cal Ripken, he really wasn't that popular for me in the mid-'80s when I started collecting. It wasn't until like the early '90s where really people started to realize his greatness, his continuous streak of games played. And he had that great year too. What was it, 90 or 91? He really became popular, but I already had his tops, had his Fleer 82. So what I really wanted was this 82 Donruss. Now we're into the top 5. Number 5, Mark McGwire. 1985, Mark McGwire. My first year, '87, Mark McGwire hit 49 home runs to win the American League Rookie of the Year. Then the Bash brothers went on to play in multiple World Series in '88 and '89, and Mark McGwire was a huge part of that Bash Brothers team that just dominated out in Oakland. And this card was the ultimate. The fact that you could get a Mark McGwire card pre-professional when he was playing with the USA baseball team was awesome. So the Donruss, the Fleer, they couldn't compete with this 85 Topps USA baseball team. Moving on to number 4, a classic card from the 1980s that was really underappreciated until late in the 80s, when Rickey Henderson started putting up some serious Hall of Fame stats, including the record-breaker steals. He eventually passes Lou Brock, and this card gets really hot. But this is an amazing card from the 1980s. If you're a collector in the late 80s, definitely a must-have. And now for all of us that have gotten back into the hobby, definitely a must-have as well. This Rickey Henderson 1980 Topps checking in at number 4. All right, number 3, 1989 Upper Deck King Griffey Jr. This may be considered by many the most popular cards of the 1980s, but for me, once again, I started collecting in '87, so this card was all about potential, right? So heard about this kid, King Griffey Jr., coming into the big leagues. His dad was Ken Griffey, who I knew of as a current player in the major leagues. But boy, did this guy live up to the billing. And this card was all the rage in 1989. You know, all the dealers wanted this card. And that's the first thing I should have known, that this was something special. Because as a kid, I had 2 of these raw. I traded one for an '84 Fleer Don Mattingly, and I thought I got a steal. And I think I traded the other one away for a Tony Gwynn rookie. Because I mean, I thought, you know, these other 2 guys, they're sure ballot Hall of Famers. And King Griffey Jr., I never, you know, like, he's just a prospect, man. Ultimately, though, as an adult, I decided, you know, to pick this card up because it is a classic 1980s, one of the best cards. Makes number 3 on my list. I've wanted to have cards as a kid, just because it still resonates today. Down to the top 2, and number 2 is this card right here, this 1986 Donruss Jose Canseco. And in the late 80s, especially after the '88 season, there was no more popular player than Jose Canseco. He had just led his team to the World Series. He was the first 40-40 guy in the history of baseball, something that had never been done. And he was still extremely young. The sky was the limit. There wasn't a Sports Center highlight that didn't include Canseco ripping off a 450-foot home run, it seemed, every night during the baseball season. And he was just an ultimate trendsetter. I remember he had a 1-900 call number you could actually call, and you know, shows up on your parents' phone bill. But that's just kind of how popular Jose Canseco was back then. He was the best player in baseball in the late 80s, and he quickly his career fell off quite dramatically. But in 1988, '87, when I was collecting, this was a huge card, and always regretted not being able to rip any '86 Donruss to get this card. Time for the number 1 card, and that would be the 1984 Donruss Don Mattingly. I was a big Don Mattingly fan, and back in the mid to late 80s, there was no greater hitter than Don Mattingly. He had average power. He had everything you needed to be a great player, and I'm sure every kid my age thought that this guy was going to be a Hall of Famer, if not for some a bad back injury that kind of limited him in his career and kind of cut it short. Don Mattingly, he might still be a Hall of Famer, but this card was the ultimate. Love the '84 Donruss. Always wanted the Mattingly card. I had the Fleer, I had the Topps, but never got the Donruss. So I was extremely excited to finally pick this up as an adult. And that's what's great about becoming an adult, right? When you have that money now to go and buy all the stuff that you couldn't afford as a kid. I think that's what's driving the passion for the hobby again, as we've seen a resurgence. But these are my top 10 cards from the 1980s that I wanted as a kid. And just stand by, I'm going to do a recap. And here we go with the recap here at the tabletop review. Number 1, Don Mattingly. 2, Jose Canseco. 3, King Griffey Jr. 4, the Rickey Henderson. 5, Mark McGwire. And then number 6, Cal Ripken Jr. 7, the Bill Ripken heir. 8, Wade Boggs. 9, Tony Gwynn. And 10, Darryl Strawberry. And we also have the honorable mention here as well with the '83 Sandberg, the Kirby Puckett, Roger Clemens, Bo Jackson, and last, Barry Bonds. Once again, everybody, I appreciate your posts, your comments, and I'll talk to you again soon.